The colossal gates of Castle Drakenheim groaned open, revealing a world of shadows and whispered secrets. Alara, a wisp of a girl with eyes the color of moss after a spring rain, clutched her worn satchel tighter. Her journey from the quiet village of Oakhaven had been long and silent, each step bringing her closer to a life she could barely imagine. She was just a maid, hired to clean the vast halls and polish the ancient silver of the Vampire King's dwelling. Her new home, if one could call it that, was less a place of warmth and more a towering monument to power and cold majesty. The air inside the castle walls was thick with scent she couldn't quite place, something like old books, damp stone, and a faint, metallic tang that tickled her nose. She wasn't used to such grandeur. Her village cottage had boasted a single, small window, while here, stained glass masterpieces soared to dizzying heights, casting pools of colored light across floors polished to a mirror shine. Tapestries depicting fierce battles and stoic ancestors hung from every wall, their threads woven with stories she'd never know. A tall, gaunt man with eyes like chipped ice, the castle's head steward, met her at the entrance. His voice was a low, dry rustle, like autumn leaves skittering across cobblestones. "You are Alara, the new scullery maid." It wasn't a question. "Your duties are simple. Clean, observe, be silent." He then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow still echoed in the cavernous space. "You will never speak unless spoken to directly. You will never, under any circumstances, look upon the royal family. They are not for your eyes." Alara swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. She nodded, her gaze fixed on a spot just past the steward's shoulder, careful not to meet his piercing stare. She understood. She was to be a ghost, a silent helper, moving through the castle without leaving a trace, without making a sound. It was a strange request, but one she felt she could fulfill. She had always been quiet, used to fading into the background. The steward led her through a maze of corridors, each one more opulent than the last. Suits of armor stood sentinel in alcoves, their empty helmets seeming to watch her as she passed. Candelabras gleamed, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows that made the statues seem to stir. Alara marveled at the sheer scale of it all. This wasn't just a castle. It was a small city within stone walls, filled with secrets and an unspoken tension that hummed in the very air. She was shown her small, cold room in the servants' quarters, a stark contrast to the grandeur above. Her bed was a simple cot, her window a narrow slit high on the wall. But it was hers, and it was a roof over her head. As days turned into weeks, Alara settled into her routine. She scrubbed floors until her hands ached, dusted ancient furniture until her arms grew tired, and polished silver until it gleamed like moonlight. She learned the rhythms of the castle, the quiet creaks of the floorboards, the distant chimes of a grandfather clock, the hushed whispers of the other servants. She moved with a purpose, a silent shadow, keeping her eyes downcast, always remembering the steward's stern warning. She learned to anticipate the needs of the household without being told, becoming an expert at being unseen. Her existence was a quiet hum in the background of a grand, ancient world, a world she was a part of, yet entirely separate from. Alara learned the rules of silence, not just from a steward's harsh words, but from the very air of Castle Drakenheim. Each servant moved like a whisper, their steps muffled, their voices low and brief. It was a place where sound seemed to be an intrusion, especially from those at the bottom of the castle's strict order. Her days were a silent ballet of chores, her brooms sweeping dust from centuries-old stones, her cloths polishing silver that gleamed like captured moonlight. She moved through the grand halls, her head always slightly bowed, her eyes trained on the patterns of the marble floor or the hem of her simple dress. The instruction about the royal family was the hardest to follow, not because she yearned to gaze upon them, but because their presence was so powerful. Sometimes a rich, deep voice would echo from a distant gallery, and the other servants would freeze, their backs stiffening. Alara would stop her work, her heart thrumming like a trapped bird against her ribs, waiting for the sound to pass. She would often hear the swish of luxurious fabrics, the soft clink of jewels, or the low murmur of conversations that sounded like hushed thunder. These were the moments when the unseen line between her world and theirs became most palpable. The other maids, gaunt and tired-looking women, were equally silent. They communicated through small nods, quick glances, or the efficient exchange of tools. No one dared to share gossip or stories, for fear that even a whisper might travel too far, reaching ears that could bring swift and terrible punishment. Alara understood their fear. She felt it too, a constant, low thrum beneath her skin. This castle was not just a home. It was a cage built of silence and shadows, for everyone but the king and his kin. One evening, as Alara was polishing a silver tea set in the great dining hall, a figure entered. She recognized the regal stride, the dark, flowing cloak from glimpses caught from the corner of her eye. It was the vampire king himself. Her breath caught, her hand stilled, the polishing cloth falling from her fingers onto the velvet tablecloth with a soft plop. She instantly dropped her gaze to her worn shoes, her heart hammering. Every fiber of her being screamed to remain still, to become truly invisible. She could feel his presence, a coldness in the air, a weight that made the very stones of the castle feel heavier. He moved slowly, his steps unhurried, as if he owned every inch of the air she breathed. She heard him approach the long, ornate dining table, then stop. He was close, too close. She could feel the subtle shift in the air currents, the faint, earthy scent that clung to him, the smell like damp soil and distant, ancient forests. Her hands, still clutching the fallen cloth, trembled slightly. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, wishing herself away, back to the simple quiet of Oakhaven. Then a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the silence. It wasn't spoken to her, but rather seemed to hang in the air, a command given to the empty room. Silence in this castle is a virtue, a discipline. Let no maid or servant forget their place, nor the peace that allows the royal family to thrive. His words were like ice, chilling her to the bone. He moved again, his footsteps receding, leaving Alara alone in the vast hall, trembling, the echo of his command ringing in her ears. After he had gone, Alara slowly straightened, her shoulders stiff. She picked up the cloth, her fingers clumsy. The king's words reinforced what she already knew. She was merely a shadow, a functionary, an invisible part of the castle's machinery. Her role was to serve without being seen, to exist without being acknowledged. Any deviation, any accidental glance, any unintentional sound could mean trouble. She pressed on with her work, the incident a stark reminder of the strict boundaries that cage her existence in this grand, silent fortress. Her life was defined by what she could not do, what she could not say, and most importantly, who she could not look at. The king's decree about Alara, though unspoken directly to her, rippled through the castle like a cold draft. It was a silent command, yet everyone understood its weight. The head steward, a man named Valerius, had taken it upon himself to ensure the king's wishes were not just followed, but deeply ingrained in the daily life of every courtier and servant. He gathered the staff shortly after Alara's arrival, his gaunt face grim in the flickering torchlight of the servants' hall. The new scullery maid, Valerius began, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that nonetheless commanded absolute attention, is to be treated as if she does not exist. She is a function, not a person. You will not acknowledge her presence. You will not speak her name. You will not look at her. She is to be invisible. His icy gaze swept across the faces of the assembled staff, lingering on those who looked less than perfectly obedient. The king himself has deemed it so. Any deviation from this command will be met with severe consequence. And so, Alara truly became a ghost in the grand castle. The other maids, already quiet and withdrawn, now averted their eyes whenever she drew near. Their conversations would abruptly cease if she happened to pass. only to resume in hushed tones once she was safely out of earshot. The kitchen staff, bustling with clanging pots and sizzling pans, would move around her as if she were a pillar, never offering a greeting, never acknowledging her help even when she handed them a clean platter or scrubbed a difficult pot. It was a chilling experience, far colder than any draft that blew through the ancient stone halls. At first, a pang of loneliness would strike Alara. Back in Oakhaven, even strangers offered a quick nod or a polite good day. Here, she was met with a wall of deliberate indifference. She would sometimes try a small, tentative smile at another maid, only to be met with a blank stare or a quick turn of the head. It was as if she were a piece of furniture, an inanimate object existing only to perform its function. She saw the subtle ways this invisible treatment manifested. If she needed a particular cleaning solution, she would have to wait for another servant to finish using it, as asking for it directly was out of the question. If she passed someone in a narrow corridor, they would squeeze past her without a word, their eyes fixed on the wall beyond her shoulder. Her name, Alara, was never spoken. She was simply the scullery maid, or more often, nothing at all. Even the castle's resident wizard, a stooped figure with a long white beard who sometimes wandered the lower halls muttering to himself, seemed to follow the king's order. He would stare right through her with his cloudy eyes, his thoughts clearly on arcane spells rather than acknowledging a lowly maid. The stable boys, the gardeners, the guards, all behave as though she were a transparent figure, a shimmer in the air that held no substance. This enforced invisibility seeped into her very being. She found herself moving more quietly, treading lighter, her presence fading even to herself. She learned to anticipate obstacles and move around them, rather than expecting anyone to give way. She became an expert at observation, noticing every detail of the castle's daily life, every nuance of its inhabitants' movements, without ever being noticed herself. It was a strange kind of freedom, this invisibility, allowing her to witness the castle's inner workings, its secrets, its hidden passages, all while being completely overlooked. The king's command had been absolute, and the court had embraced it with unwavering discipline. Alara existed. She worked, she breathed, but in the eyes of Castle Drakenheim, she was nothing. She was a silent, unseen cog in the vast, Gothic machine, a shadow among shadows, a maid who was not even granted the dignity of being seen. The days Alara spent in Castle Drakenheim blurred into a routine of silent work and observation. She knew the castle's every hidden nook and secret passage, every cobweb-laden corner, and every sunlit window. Her eyes, though trained to avoid direct gazes, took in everything else, painting a detailed picture of the lives lived around her, lives she was not meant to touch. She often saw the young prince, Adrian, from afar. He was a small, pale boy, usually surrounded by tutors or courtiers, his laughter seldom heard, replaced by serious murmurs and lessons. He looked fragile, like a snowdrop in winter, often dressed in dark velvets that made him seem even smaller. One afternoon, Alara was polishing the grand marble staircase that swirled up to the royal chambers. Sunlight, rare in the castle's shadowy depths, streamed through a high window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The castle was unusually alive that day, with a flurry of activity as courtiers prepared for a special evening gathering. She could hear the rustle of gowns, the clink of glasses, and the low hum of conversation drifting from the great hall. Suddenly, a piercing cry shattered the castle's practiced calm. It was a child's scream, filled with terror and pain, echoing down the stone corridors. Alara froze, her heart leaping in her throat. This was not the polite murmur of court life. This was raw, unfiltered distress. More screams followed, ragged and broken, accompanied by the frantic shouts of adults. Then, the young Prince Adrian appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his small body convulsing. He seemed to lose control, tumbling down the first few steps, his dark clothes a blur against the pale marble. Servants and courtiers scattered, their faces frozen in horror, their elegant movements dissolving into chaotic fear. No one moved to catch him. It was as if a spell had been cast, paralyzing them all. They gasped, clutched at each other, but remained rooted to their spots, eyes wide with terror. Adrian continued to fall, his cries growing weaker, his small limbs flailing helplessly. He hit the landing with a sickening thud, then rolled further down, his body limp. A dark, thick liquid, the color of midnight wine, began to seep from beneath him, spreading slowly across the pristine marble. His eyes, usually a solemn shade of gray, were wide and unfocused, glazed with pain and something wild. A violent tremor ran through his small frame. Alara had never seen such a sight. The young prince, so protected and elevated, now lay broken and vulnerable. The air filled with gasps and choked whispers, but still no one dared to approach. Fear, cold and absolute, held the court captive. They looked at the prince with a mixture of terror and reverence, as if even in his suffering he was untouchable, too sacred for their mere mortal hands. But Alara saw only a child, hurt and in need. The careful training, the strict warnings, the king's decree of her invisibility, all faded into nothingness in the face of such raw desperation. Her hands, usually so accustomed to their silent chores, now gripped the marble banister, her knuckles white. Her breath hitched. The image of the little boy, so small, so utterly alone in his pain, burned into her mind. He wasn't just the prince. He was a child suffering. And in that moment, something shifted inside Alara, a quiet resolve hardening where fear had once been. The rules of the castle, the unspoken laws that governed her existence, suddenly seemed less important than the urgent, terrifying reality unfolding before her eyes. The terror that gripped the castle staff was a palpable thing, a heavy cloak that smothered any instinct to help. Court physicians, usually quick to attend to the slightest sniffle of a royal, stood frozen, their medical bags clutched to their chests like shields. Their faces, normally composed, were now masks of pure dread. They understood the ancient laws of the castle, laws that dictated strict distance from the royal bloodline, especially during moments of weakness or illness. To touch a royal without direct command was not just a breach of etiquette. It was an act of unthinkable transgression, often punished severely. The ladies of the court, dressed in their finest silks and velvets for the evening's gathering, stood huddled together, their delicate hands pressed to their mouths to stifle gasps. Their eyes darted from the convulsing prince to each other, a silent question passing between them. Who dares? None did. They were trained in the arts of courtly grace, in elegant conversation, in managing grand estates, but not in crisis. Their world was one of strict rules and protocols, and this sudden, raw display of pain had no place in their carefully constructed reality. To intervene might mean drawing the king's terrible wrath upon themselves, a risk too great to contemplate. Even the hardened castle guards, who usually stood firm and unwavering, seemed to have turned to stone. Their hands remained on the hilts of their swords, but they made no move towards the fallen prince. They were there to protect, yes, but protecting also meant maintaining the order, the strict separation between sovereign and subject. To step forward now would be to cross a boundary, one that had been etched into the very foundations of the castle for centuries. They were sworn to uphold the king's will, and the king's will, as Alara knew too well, was that no one acknowledged those who served, let alone touch the royal family. The head steward, Valerius, usually so commanding, was perhaps the most paralyzed of all. His face, already pale, had turned ashen. He stood rigid, his gaze fixed on the prince, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had enforced the king's decrees with ruthless efficiency, instilling fear and obedience into every servant. Now, seeing the direct consequence of such rigid control, he was trapped by his own making. He knew the strictures against touching the royals without explicit permission. He also knew that failure to act could be seen as dereliction of duty. He was caught between two impossible choices, and in his indecision, he did nothing. A cook, peering from the kitchen entrance, dropped a tray of pastries, the clatter echoing loudly in the sudden, eerie silence that followed Adrian's fall. Even this small sound seemed too much, an act of sacrilege in the face of royal suffering. The kitchen staff, who had moments ago been bustling with activity, now stood perfectly still, their faces smeared with flour, eyes wide and unblinking. No one spoke. No one moved. The air was thick with unspoken fear, with the weight of centuries of strict hierarchy and the terrifying power of the vampire king. Every single person present, from the highest-ranking noble to the lowliest kitchen hand, was utterly paralyzed, bound by an invisible chain of fear and protocol. They were terrified not just of the prince's unknown ailment, but of the king's reaction, of breaking the unwritten laws, of stepping out of line. It was a fear bred into them, taught to them, and now it held them captive, rendering them useless in the face of immediate need. They could only watch, their breath held, their hearts pounding, as the young prince continued to convulse, alone on the cold marble floor. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the prince's ragged gasps and the soft, desperate whimpers escaping his pale lips. Alara watched, her breath held tight in her chest. The fear that had paralyzed everyone else was a cold hand gripping her own heart, but beneath it, a fiercer, warmer feeling began to bloom. It was a sense of fierce protectiveness, an echo of the human kindness she had known in her village, where a child in distress was always met with helping hands. She saw the court physicians, their faces blanched with terror, their hands fumbling with their instrument bags, but never quite opening them. She saw the ladies of the court, their silks rustling as they pressed closer to each other, their whispers like frightened mice. The guards, usually so imposing, stood like statues, their eyes wide with a fear that seemed to override their duty. No one moved. No one dared. But Adrian was still suffering. His small body twitched, a dark stain spreading on the marble beneath him. His eyes, unfocused and glazed, seemed to plead for help that no one was offering. In that moment, the king's decree, Valerius's chilling warnings, the unspoken rules of invisibility, they all dissolved into meaningless dust. All that mattered was the child, hurting alone. A small, defiant spark ignited within Alara. She was just a maid, an unseen shadow, but she was also a human being. And a human being did not stand by while a child suffered. Without a conscious thought, without weighing the terrible consequences, her feet moved. She pushed off from the marble banister, her simple, worn dress a blur against the polished stone. Her steps, usually so quiet and measured, now pounded with a desperate urgency. She ran. She didn't look at the shocked faces of the courtiers, the wide, terrified eyes of the other servants. She didn't heed the sharp, collective intake of breath that rippled through the assembled crowd as she broke the invisible barrier of fear. Her focus was solely on the small, broken figure of the prince. She reached him in a few swift strides, dropping to her knees beside him without a moment's hesitation. The metallic tang of blood was strong in the air, but she ignored it. She ignored the way his body trembled, the dark foam at his lips. All she saw was the desperate need. Her hands, usually used for scrubbing and polishing, were surprisingly gentle as she touched his forehead. It was burning hot. He whimpered again, his small hand clenching into a tiny fist. His eyes flickered, meeting hers for a fleeting second, a silent plea. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers, a sound of horror and disbelief. Alara had not only looked at the royal family, she had touched one of them. She had broken every single rule, every single warning. She had defied the king's implicit command for her to remain invisible. But Alara didn't care. She barely registered the horrified stares, the shocked whispers that began to erupt like a sudden storm. Her only thought was for the fragile life before her. The weight of all the castle's rules, all its fear, all its ancient history, pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. But the small, trembling body of the prince, so vulnerable in her hands, was heavier still, demanding her attention, demanding her help. She had stepped out of the shadows, and there was no turning back. Kneeling beside Prince Adrian, Alara felt the heat radiating from his small body, saw the unnatural pallor of his skin, and the wild, unfocused fear in his eyes. The dark liquid seeping from him was not just blood from his fall. It was too rich, too vibrant, clearly a sign of some inner torment. She knew, with an instinct she couldn't explain, that this was not a simple injury. He was fading, and quickly. The physicians, still frozen in place, muttered among themselves about the fever of the blood and a turning sickness, but offered no solutions, only terrified whispers. Alara, however, remembered the old tales from her village, stories her grandmother had told her by the hearth on cold nights. Tales of strange ailments that sometimes afflicted the powerful, ailments that could only be cured by a selfless act, a giving of life itself. And she knew what that meant. Her gaze fell upon the small, ornate dagger that usually hung from the belt of the royal guard who stood closest, rigid with fear. It was a beautiful thing, meant for ceremony, not for bloodletting. But Alara saw it as a tool, a chance. Without a second thought, she reached out, plucking the dagger from its sheath before the stunned guard could even react. A collective gasp, louder this time, swept through the hall. Not only had she touched the prince, but now she was armed, a lowly maid with a royal weapon. She ignored the rising panic, the frantic whispers that started to turn into horrified exclamations. Her focus was entirely on Adrian. She held the dagger, its silver blade glinting in the faint light. Her own hand trembled, not from fear for herself, but from the enormity of what she was about to do. This was an act of rebellion, of sacrifice, of absolute defiance against every rule that bound her. With a swift, decisive movement, Alara pressed the tip of the dagger against the soft skin of her inner wrist. A sharp, stinging pain, then a bead of scarlet welled up, quickly followed by a steady flow. Her blood, warm and life-giving, trickled down her pale skin. She didn't flinch. She barely registered the pain. Carefully, tenderly, she guided her bleeding wrist to Adrian's lips. His eyes fluttered, his small body still racked with shivers. He was too weak to drink on his own. With a gentle hand, Alara tilted his head, letting a few drops of her blood fall onto his tongue. For a moment, nothing happened. The courtyard held its breath, a terrifying silence descending once more. Then a subtle change. Adrian's shivers lessened. A faint color, barely perceptible, returned to his ashen cheeks. He whimpered again, but this time it was different, less a cry of pain, more a soft sigh. His small mouth opened a fraction wider, almost instinctively. Alara understood. He needed more. She pressed her wrist more firmly against his lips, allowing a steady stream to flow into his mouth. The metallic taste of her own blood filled her senses, but she pushed it away, focusing only on the prince. She felt a strange lightness begin to spread through her, a dizzying sensation as her own life force ebbed away. But with each drop that Adrian swallowed, she saw a flicker of life return to him. His breathing deepened, becoming more even. The violent tremors ceased. His small hands unclenched, his fingers twitching faintly. The court watched, mesmerized and horrified. They saw the maid, bleeding for the prince, offering her very essence to save him. It was an act so far outside their comprehension, so utterly forbidden, that they could only stare. The king was nowhere to be seen, but the air thrummed with the gravity of Alara's actions. She was giving life, defying death, and in doing so, she was shattering the very foundations of their rigid world. Alara continued to feed him, until Adrian's small body stilled, his eyes closing, not in pain, but in a deep, peaceful slumber. As Alara watched the young prince drift into a peaceful sleep, a wave of exhaustion washed over her. Her head swam, and a chill spread through her limbs as the adrenaline faded, leaving her weak from the loss of blood. She carefully withdrew her wrist from Adrian's lips, pressing her thumb against the wound to slow the flow. The dagger, still clutched in her other hand, felt impossibly heavy. The court, which had been a tableau of frozen horror moments before, now stirred. Whispers erupted, louder and more frantic than before. The physicians, no longer paralyzed, rushed forward, their fear now replaced by a scientific curiosity mixed with lingering dread. They carefully examined the sleeping prince, their gloved hands probing gently. One of them, a man with spectacles perched on his nose, peered closely at Adrian's pale face. He touched the boy's forehead, then his wrist, his eyes widening behind the glass. His fever. "It has broken," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "The convulsions have ceased. His pulse is strong, steady." Another physician, older, more experienced, leaned in, sniffing the air around Adrian. The scent of human blood. Fresh, vibrant, he murmured, glancing at Alara's still bleeding wrist. It seems the maid's offering has stabilized him." The courtiers, who had been murmuring about sacrilege and punishment, now looked at Adrian with a dawning sense of wonder. The dark, rich liquid that had seeped from him earlier had almost vanished, absorbed back into his skin, leaving only a faint, reddish stain on the marble. His skin, though still pale, had lost its deathly pallor, replaced by a subtle, healthy glow. His breathing was even and deep, the signs of a restful sleep. Valerius, the head steward, was the first to approach Alara, though he kept a respectful distance. His face was a mixture of awe and terror. He looked at her bleeding wrist, then at the sleeping prince, then back at her, as if trying to reconcile the invisible maid with the miracle worker. He cleared his throat, but no words came out. Alara felt a strange blend of relief and apprehension. Relief that Adrian was no longer suffering, apprehension for what her actions meant for her. She was no longer invisible. She was undeniably, spectacularly seen, and she had broken every single rule. As the physicians continued their examinations, confirming Adrian's steady recovery, a buzz of hushed amazement spread through the hall. "She saved him," a lady whispered, her voice barely audible. "The scullery maid. She saved the prince." Alara could feel the eyes of everyone on her. Their gazes were no longer those of calculated avoidance, but of intense, bewildered scrutiny. She had risked everything for a child she was forbidden to even look at, and in doing so, she had revealed a power, a courage that none of them possessed. She was no longer just a maid. She was the one who had dared to act when all others had stood frozen in fear. The prince's recovery was not just a physical change. It was a shift in the very atmosphere of the castle, a quiet revolution brought about by an act of unexpected kindness. The air, once thick with dread, now hummed with a fragile, uncertain hope. The air in the grand hall, once thick with the scent of human blood and the lingering fear of Adrian's illness, now crackled with a different kind of tension. Alara, weak but steady, stood beside the sleeping prince, the dagger still clutched loosely in her hand, her wrist throbbing. The murmurs of relief over Adrian's recovery quickly morphed into hushed, terrified whispers about her. Every eye in the room was fixed on Alara, but not with gratitude or awe. Instead, their gazes were heavy with dread, a silent consensus forming amongst the courtiers and servants alike. They all knew the rules, and Alara had shattered every single one. She had spoken, she had looked directly at the royal family, she had touched the prince, and most damningly, she had taken a weapon from a guard and drawn blood. Her own, but blood nonetheless, in the presence of the royal court. These were not small infractions. They were acts of unimaginable defiance, violations of ancient customs that carried the gravest of penalties. Valerius, the head steward, finally found his voice, though it was strained and high-pitched. "Guards," he croaked, his eyes darting between Alara and the still form of the prince. "Seize her. She has committed treason." His words echoed with the fear that gripped him, the fear of the king's inevitable wrath. He believed he was simply upholding the law, anticipating the justice that must surely fall upon the audacious maid. The guards, shaken from their earlier paralysis, now moved with grim purpose. Two heavily armored men stepped forward, their gauntlets clanking softly against their plate. Their faces were impassive, but Alara could feel the weight of their judgment, the grim understanding that they were merely instruments of the castle's implacable law. Alara didn't resist. She knew what was coming. She had known the moment she decided to defy the unspoken command to stand still. She had made her choice, and she was prepared to face the consequences. A strange calm settled over her, a quiet dignity that belied her humble origins. She had saved a child, and in that, she found a solace that no punishment could take away. The ladies of the court gasped, some even shedding tears, but none spoke out in her defense. They pitied her, perhaps, but their loyalty to the king and their own survival outweighed any fleeting sympathy. The physicians, who had just marveled at Adrian's recovery, now retreated, their faces solemn. Their science had no power against royal decree, and they understood that Alara's life was forfeit despite her heroic act. Whispers of execution, beheading, and the dungeon snaked through the crowd. Some even suggested a more agonizing end, a slow draining of her blood, a morbid mirroring of her selfless act. They expected the king to appear at any moment, a dark fury in his eyes, to deliver the swift and terrible justice that was his right. Alara closed her eyes for a brief moment, picturing the sun-drenched fields of Oakhaven, the kind faces of her neighbors. She knew she would never see them again. She had traded her quiet, unseen life for one moment of courage, one moment of true human connection. And for that, she was about to pay the ultimate price. The two guards reached her, their hands outstretched, ready to take her. The collective breath of the court was held, waiting for the inevitable. The stage was set for her punishment, a grim reminder to all in Castle Drakenheim of the unyielding power of their vampire king. Just as the guards' heavy boots scraped against the marble, poised to seize Alara, a new presence swept into the hall. The air grew colder, heavier, and a silence more profound than any before descended. All eyes, which had been fixed on Alara and the approaching guards, now snapped to the massive archway leading to the royal chambers. There stood the vampire king, his tall, imposing figure framed by the shadows. His face, usually a mask of regal indifference, was etched with a fury that made even the bravest guards flinch. His eyes, twin pools of burning ember, scanned the scene. His unconscious son, the trembling courtiers, the advancing guards, and finally, Alara, standing defiant beside Adrian. Valerius, the head steward, visibly quaked. "Your Majesty," he stammered, bowing so deeply his head nearly scraped the floor. "The maid. She defied your orders. She touched the prince. She drew blood. We were just apprehending her for treason." The king's gaze, however, did not linger on Valerius. Instead, it pierced through the crowd, settling on Alara. For a long, terrifying moment, the only sound was the distant drip of water from some unseen fountain. Alara met his stare, not with defiance, but with a quiet acceptance of her fate. She was ready. Then, something extraordinary happened. The king began to move, not towards Valerius, not towards the guards, but directly towards Alara. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing in the stunned silence. The guards froze, their hands still outstretched, unsure whether to complete their task or fall back. He reached the place where Adrian lay, still sleeping peacefully. His eyes, full of a raw, desperate love Alara had never imagined possible from the fearsome king, softened as he looked at his son. He knelt beside Adrian, gently touching his forehead, then his small, unblemished hand. A flicker of relief, profound and unexpected, crossed his features. Then the king turned his gaze back to Alara. His eyes traveled from Adrian's peaceful face to her pale, exhausted features, then to her bandaged wrist, still stained with a faint trace of red. He saw the dagger still loosely held in her hand, the symbol of her forbidden act. And then, in a move that shocked every single soul in the Grand Hall, the Vampire King, ruler of these lands, a being of immense power and ancient lineage, lowered himself further. He knelt. He knelt before Alara, the humble scullery maid, his dark robes pooling around him on the cold marble floor. His head, usually held so high, was bowed slightly, his fiery gaze now filled with an emotion Alara couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of respect, gratitude, and something akin to humility. The collective gasp from the court was deafening, a wave of pure disbelief. Physicians dropped their instruments. Ladies of the court fainted. Guards stared, their jaws agape. Valerius, the ever-loyal steward, looked as if he might crumble into dust. The king, kneeling before a maid. It was an act that defied all logic, all hierarchy, all the ancient traditions of their vampire world. Alara herself was stunned. She had braced herself for fury, for punishment, for death. But this act of profound reverence from the most powerful being she had ever known left her speechless, her quiet acceptance of her fate completely overturned. The weight of his gaze, once terrifying, now felt like a solemn question, an acknowledgement of her courage that transcended all the rules he had ever set. The vampire king remained kneeling before Alara, his powerful presence filling the silence with a new, unexpected weight. His eyes, no longer burning with fury but with a deep, piercing intelligence, held hers. He didn't speak, but in that profound silence, Alara felt as though he saw past her worn dress and her lowly station, past the strictures of the castle, and directly into her heart. He saw the raw, unthinking courage that had compelled her to act when everyone else had frozen. He understood the immense risk she had taken, the absolute disregard for her own safety and the king's terrible laws. He knew, with chilling clarity, the fear that gripped his court, a fear he himself had cultivated for centuries. And yet, this simple maid, this invisible girl, had overcome it all for the sake of his son. His gaze swept over the petrified faces of his courtiers, the trembling physicians, the stunned guards. He saw their terror, their relief that Adrian was safe, and their absolute bewilderment at his own actions. He saw their ingrained obedience, their fear of punishment, their adherence to protocol above all else. But in Alara, he saw something else entirely. He saw the pure, unselfish kindness that had driven her to offer her own lifeblood. It was a compassion that transcended social standing, a simple human decency that had been utterly absent from his court in that moment of crisis. His most loyal subjects, his most learned scholars, his fiercest warriors, none had dared to act. Yet a mere scullery maid, who had been commanded to be nothing, had become everything. A soft, almost inaudible sigh escaped the king's lips. It was a sound of profound realization, of a truth long hidden by the veils of power and ancient tradition. He, the immortal ruler, had spent centuries building a fortress of fear, believing it was the only way to maintain order and protect his bloodline. He had fostered a culture where even a glance in his direction was forbidden, where compassion was seen as weakness, and where self-preservation reigned supreme. And in doing so, he had inadvertently created a court utterly incapable of true courage when it mattered most. His son, his precious Adrian, had nearly perished not from the illness itself, but from the paralyzing fear of those who should have protected him. It was a humbling, bitter truth. The one who had saved Adrian was not a noble, nor a physician, nor a guard. It was the lowest among them, the one deemed insignificant, the one ordered to be invisible. The king finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the silent hall. "You," he said, his gaze still fixed on Alara, "have shown a courage that shames us all." His words were not a condemnation, but an acknowledgement, a heavy, heartfelt truth. You risked everything. You gave of yourself when none others would. You saved my son. He looked at the wound on her wrist, then at the small, sleeping form of Adrian. "The blood of Drakenheim runs cold," he continued, his voice laced with a newfound vulnerability. "But the heart that beats within this maid, it burns with a warmth we have long forgotten." He slowly rose, his movements deliberate, never breaking eye contact with Alara. The dagger fell from her hand, clattering softly on the marble. His presence loomed over her, not threateningly, but with an immense, almost overwhelming weight of gratitude and regret. He had believed himself to be the ultimate judge of worth, yet a humble maid had revealed the true measure of a being. He had ordered her to be unseen, but now he saw her more clearly than anyone else in his entire castle. As the vampire king rose from his knees, the silence in the hall was so absolute it seemed to hum. His eyes, still fixed on Alara, swept over the stunned faces of his court. He saw the terror, the confusion, and the dawning realization of a seismic shift. This was not merely an act of gratitude. It was a public declaration, a dismantling of centuries of rigid tradition right before their very eyes. Valerius, the king's voice boomed, no longer a low rumble but a clear, resonant command that echoed through the vast space. The head steward, still pale and trembling, snapped to attention. "You spoke of treason. You spoke of punishment. Tell me, steward, what greater treason is there than allowing a child to perish through fear and inaction?" Valerius stammered, unable to form a coherent reply. The king's gaze was a physical weight pressing down on him. "This maid," the king continued, gesturing towards Alara, who stood, still and silent, a small, courageous figure amidst the opulent grandeur, "whom I commanded you to treat as invisible, has proven herself more visible, more vital than any of you." His eyes swept over the physicians, the guards, the ladies of the court. "Her courage, her compassion, saved my son's life. While all of you, bound by fear of my decrees, stood paralyzed, she acted." He paused, letting his words sink into the petrified minds of his subjects. "From this night forward," he declared, his voice firm and unwavering, "the rules of this castle are changed. The measure of a being's worth will no longer be determined by their bloodline, their title, or their proximity to my throne. It will be measured by their heart, by their capacity for courage and compassion, by their willingness to act when others falter." A collective gasp rippled through the hall, less of terror and more of sheer disbelief. The very foundation of their existence, the hierarchy that had dictated their lives for generations, was being uprooted. The invisible maid, the lowest of the low, had become the catalyst for this monumental change. The king then turned his full attention back to Alara. "Alara," he said, using her name, a name that had been forbidden to be spoken in his court. The sound of it, spoken by him, was like a chime in the suddenly altered atmosphere. "You have served this castle with your hands. Now, you will serve it with your heart and your wisdom." He extended a hand to her, not a hand of command, but of invitation. "Rise, Alara. You are no longer merely a maid. You are a valued member of this court, and your counsel will be sought." Alara, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, hesitated for a moment. Then, slowly, she placed her small, injured hand in his large, powerful one. The touch was not cold, as she might have expected, but surprisingly warm, a silent promise of a new beginning. As she rose, the court watched, transfixed. The once invisible maid now stood beside the king, an equal in spirit, if not in station. That night, the castle's ancient stones seemed to shift, adapting to a new truth. The rigid lines of power, once so clearly drawn, blurred and softened. The fear that had long governed the court began to recede, replaced by a confused but undeniable sense of hope. The king's decree of invisibility had been shattered, not by rebellion, but by an act of pure, selfless love. And in its place, a new order, built on courage and compassion, began to take root. The whispers that night were no longer of punishment, but of wonder, of the maid who had changed everything. In the days and nights that followed, Castle Drakenheim was transformed. The shift wasn't immediate or without its difficulties, but the king's declaration had shattered the old order, creating a ripple effect that touched every corner of the ancient stronghold. Alara, no longer the invisible maid, now walked the halls with a quiet confidence, her presence acknowledged by everyone. The first change was subtle. Other servants, once afraid to even glance her way, now offered shy smiles or small nods of greeting. Valerius, the head steward, initially struggled with the new reality. He still maintained his rigid posture, but his eyes, when they met Alara's, held a flicker of respect, perhaps even a hint of fear of this new, unexpected power. He found himself seeking her opinion on matters he would have dismissed as beneath him before, especially concerning the welfare of the younger staff. Alara's duties shifted dramatically. She was no longer scrubbing floors or polishing silver. Instead, she became an advisor, a confidant, especially to the king himself. He often sought her out in the quiet hours of the night, discussing not just matters of the castle, but the very nature of compassion and leadership. He saw in her a moral compass, a connection to a humanity he and his court had long suppressed. Prince Adrian, once recovered, formed an immediate and strong bond with Alara. He was a changed boy, no longer as frail or withdrawn. His laughter began to echo through the halls, and he often sought Alara's company, preferring her gentle stories to the dry lessons of his tutors. She taught him about the simple joys of the outside world, about flowers and sunshine, things that were often overlooked in the shadowed castle. The court itself slowly began to thaw. The constant fear of the king's wrath lessened, replaced by a growing understanding that true strength lay not in rigid adherence to rules, but in empathy and courage. The physicians, humbled by Alara's actions, started to view their roles with a renewed sense of purpose, engaging more directly with the needs of the castle's inhabitants, not just the royals. The guards, too, found a new meaning in their protection, realizing that the castle's true heart lay in the well-being of all its people, not just its rulers. Alara became the bridge between the two worlds within the castle, the ancient, powerful, and often cold world of the vampires, and the humble, warm, and human world of the servants. Her presence reminded everyone that compassion was a universal language, that bravery could come from the most unexpected places, and that even the smallest act of kindness could shatter centuries of fear. She never forgot her roots in Oakhaven, bringing a touch of that simple, honest kindness to the grand, Gothic halls. The castle, once a place of silent dread, began to hum with a new kind of life. It wasn't just a place of power anymore. It was becoming a home, united by the quiet strength of a maid who dared to be seen. Alara, once ignored, had become the heart that truly brought two worlds, two ways of life, together within the stone walls of Castle Drakenheim. Her story became a legend whispered through the castle, a reminder that true royalty lay not in blood, but in spirit.